Okay, so tonight's lecture is going to be on the endocrine system. This is chapter 11, and I think that you're going to find that you like this lecture or enjoy this lecture a little bit more maybe than the nervous system lectures, and that this lecture is really straightforward. It's a very straightforward lecture, and there's not quite as much to this lecture as the nervous system, so it'll be a nice break after the last series of lectures. Um, so let's dive into the endocrine system here. So, and as you're going to see, this shows you some of the endocrine system organs that we're going to go over tonight. There's quite a few glands that belong to the endocrine system, and the endocrine system is primarily going to be responsible for your release of hormones. So we have the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the thymus, and so far. We'll go over the rest of the endocrine glands as we go through, like the adrenal gland and the pancreas, as we go through the lecture tonight. So we'll hit on all of these glands and what hormones they release and what their function is. Okay, so I'm gonna pick my pen color real quick here. Oops. And then we will dive in. We're going to try red tonight. And then we will dive into the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is made up of the cells, tissues, and organs that are involved with secreting hormones into bodily fluids. And so this is important to remember that we're secreting hormones into bodily fluids, especially i.e. the blood. So when we look at the body has two different types of glands. We're going to be talking about the endocrine glands, but I want you to know that there are also a different type of gland that we'll talk about later on that comprises many of our other systems, and that's the exocrine glands. Exocrine glands are going to be responsible for secreting substances into ducts. So for example, like your sebaceous gland. Your sebaceous gland secretes oil, right, into a duct that leads to the surface of the skin. Same with sweat. Your sweat glands secrete sweat again, and that sweat will make its way through a duct to the surface of the skin. So those are your exocrine glands, and you have exocrine glands that secrete other things like mucus and digestive glands as well. So those, and when we get to the digestive system, we'll talk about some of these digestive exocrine glands that are going to be secreting different substances. So again, keep in mind that those are exocrine glands. That's what we're not talking about in this lecture. So we are not going to be talking about exocrine glands. We are going to be talking only about endocrine glands. But I do want you to know what exocrine glands are from endocrine glands since we're talking about endocrine glands. So for the exam purposes, I do want you to be able to know the difference between exocrine and endocrine. But then for the purpose of this lecture, I want you to know that we're talking only about endocrine glands. And endocrine glands are going to be secreting, again, their products, primarily hormones, what we call hormones, into the bloodstream. And once we secrete those hormones into the bloodstream, their goal is to have some type of effect on their target cell. So hormones are going to be a way that we can regulate and help to control homeostasis in the body. So again, these are all the glands that we're going to be talking about tonight are endocrine glands, hence the name for the endocrine system. So some general characteristics of the endocrine system. The endocrine system functions to communicate with cells using, again, chemicals called hormones. So when you look at how the body when we're talking about the different systems, how those different systems are controlled, they're controlled primarily by two different systems. They're controlled, one, by the nervous system, and two, by the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is one of your mechanisms by which we control different functions that occur in the body. And again, they do this through hormones. Endocrine glands and their hormones regulate various metabolic processes. And we'll talk about some of these different metabolic processes that they can regulate tonight. Now, when we talk about hormones hormones, in general, their actions are very precise. And what that means is that they only affect specific target cells. So for a hormone to affect a certain target cell, because remember these hormones are going to be traveling throughout your bloodstream, throughout the body, but they're only going to have an effect on the target cells that display the right receptor for them. So for example, here you see an endocrine cell secreting hormone into the bloodstream, and that hormone travels through the bloodstream to some distant target cells. And again, it's only going to affect those very specific cells that have that specific receptor for that specific hormone. So hormones only affect, again, target cells with specific membrane proteins that are called receptors. And that makes this mechanism of control very precise. Okay, so endocrine glands are going to include the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is going to be up here in the brain, just below the hypothalamus. The thyroid gland is going to be here in the neck. So, and again, the pituitary gland, I should draw it in here. The pituitary gland is going to be up here. The parathyroid glands, you're not going to be able to see. They're actually on the back side of the thyroid gland here. So that's where the parathyroid, and I'll show you a picture of that later on. The adrenal glands are going to be just above the kidneys. So here the adrenal glands are kind of hidden back here in a shadow because they would be, again, back just above the kidneys. The pancreas, so the pancreas again would be in here. It's part of the digestive system. And you're going to have, we'll talk about some other hormone secreting glands and tissues as well, so things like the thymus. And we'll talk about tissues again in the testes and the ovaries that will secrete hormones. So before we get into some of these specific endocrine organs and the specific hormones that they're going to secrete, we're going to talk about the two major types of chemical classes for hormones, the two types of classes that we can break hormones up into. So those two classes are steroid hormones, which are going to be our cholesterol-based hormones, and then we're going to have our non-steroid, or what we call protein-based hormones. And so you're going to see that these two classes of hormones are going to have, oops, I apologize for that, they're going to have two very different mechanisms of action. So your steroid hormones are what we call lipid soluble, okay? And what that means is that since they're lipid soluble, that means that they can dissolve or mesh well with other lipids. And so these steroid hormones are actually going to be able to pass right through that lipid bilayer of the plasma membrane in a cell. So steroid hormones can pass right through the cell membranes because, again, they're what we call lipid soluble. So there are going to be receptors for these steroid hormones, not on top of the target cells, but actually located in the target cell, inside the nucleus of the target cell. Okay, and again, that's because these steroid hormones can pass right through that cell membrane and right through the nuclear membrane and into the nucleus itself. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute here. Your non-steroid, or what we call protein-based hormones, are what we call water-soluble, okay? And so that means that they are, these hormones are charged because they're interacting with water molecules which are charged. So because they're charged, remember, things that are large and charged don't like to pass through that lipid bilayer. Because these are charged, they cannot pass through the cell membranes. So what that means is these non-steroid hormones are going to combine with receptors on the target cell membrane surface, and then they will have second messengers that will bring the signal into the cell. So those non-steroid hormones cannot, or those protein-based hormones cannot enter the cell membrane, so they have to pass on their message to these second messengers that are inside the cell. So let's talk a little bit more about how this happens again. And so we're going to start with the action of lipid-soluble steroid hormones, and then we'll come back to those protein-based ones. So again, remember that these lipid-soluble steroid hormones are going to be able to go right through that plasma membrane. So the hormone, in terms of the steps that would be involved here, the hormone will first, again, leave the bloodstream, right? Because remember, hormones are traveling through the bloodstream, leave the bloodstream, and as they do, they will diffuse out and then diffuse right through that phospholipid bilayer and into the cell. Now, as they diffuse into the cell, they'll move through the nuclear pores into the nucleus, and they'll bind to a receptor inside the nucleus that will turn either on or off a specific gene. And so if it turns on a specific gene, which is often the case, then when it turns on that gene, now that gene is going to code for messenger RNA to be made, and that will direct from that messenger RNA, then we make protein. So really, by binding to and turning on a gene, we make new messenger RNA that then directs the synthesis of new proteins. And these new proteins that are being made inside the cell will alter some type of activity inside that cell. That's how the hormone is able to control these specific cells. So that's how steroid hormones work. Again, the big things to remember here are that these are lipid soluble, they diffuse right through the phospholipid bilayer, and their mechanism of action is to bind to a receptor inside the nucleus, turning on a certain gene, or it can be turning off. Oftentimes it's turning on a certain gene though, that will then direct new messenger RNA and a new protein to be made, and that new protein will alter the activity of the cell. So again, this is just showing you the same thing as steroid hormone going right through that lipid bilayer, through the nuclear pore to bind to some, again, hormone receptor that would then turn on a gene. Now again, the action of water-soluble hormones is going to be just the opposite. These cannot diffuse through the plasma membrane. So again, these water-soluble hormones, just like any other hormone, will travel through the bloodstream, but instead now, since they cannot diffuse through the plasma membrane, the hormone will then bind to, and that's what you're seeing here. Here's your water-soluble hormone binding to a receptor on the cell surface in the cell membrane. And that hormone receptor is going to be what we call an integral membrane protein. If you remember this from way back from our early cell lecture, this is just a membrane protein that is literally embedded in the cell membrane. And that's going to act as our first messenger. Okay? So then, when that hormone binds to that membrane receptor or that first messenger, then that first messenger will pass on that message or relay that message to a second messenger that's inside the cell. And that second messenger will then again signal oftentimes a cascade of events to occur that will result in that response that was originally again intended for. So, and that response being that it changes some activity inside the cell. So that's how water-soluble hormones work. Now let's talk a little bit more about how some of these water-soluble hormones work, because water-soluble hormones are again much more complex because they have this cascade pathway that occurs. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through an example of this. So again, here, in this case, a non-steroid hormone, or oftentimes what we call a protein-based hormone, again, cannot travel through the plasma membrane, so it's going to bind to some hormone receptor complex. Now, this hormone receptor complex is your first messenger, and it oftentimes is going to stimulate a cascade of events that will ultimately result in the production of a second messenger. So in this case, you have G proteins, which end up being your first messenger. And your G proteins ultimately will turn on an enzyme that will then cause a conversion of ATP to cyclic AMP. Now, that cyclic AMP is what we call your second messenger. You don't have to know these all of these steps. All you have to know is that the message is being passed on to a second messenger. But I like this example because at least gives you an idea of how this all happens. So this secondary messenger then oftentimes goes to turn on and activate an enzyme. And that's this protein kinase is an enzyme. And then this enzyme will then turn our substrate, whatever it is, from an inactive form into an active form. And that active form of that substrate then is oftentimes what causes some type of change of activity inside the cell. So again, you don't have to know all of these steps involved. I just kind of went through this as an example so you can see how this works. But in terms of what you're responsible for the exam, you do not need to know G proteins and cyclic AMP. You just need to know that that hormone, again, as it moves through the bloodstream, is going to then bind to a receptor on the cell membrane surface. And that receptor is what we call the first messenger. And then that first messenger will then relay that information onto a second messenger, which will then relay the signal into the cell for that ultimate response to occur. So that's how water-soluble hormones work. Now you may say, you look at this and you go, why are there so many steps in this pathway? Why not just, have this first messenger relay the message directly on to cause the cellular changes? Why have a second messenger and then all of these cascade processes in between? And so we're going to talk about why this is. And so there's actually a great benefit to having this type of cascade pathway. And that is that the hormone actions can be greatly amplified in the target cell. And the way that this happens is that initially, again, when you have one single hormone, okay, we'll just say one hormone binds to one receptor on the cell surface, okay? So we have one molecule there. That oftentimes causes the activation of many of these secondary messengers. And so technically your first messenger here would be your G protein. And so if you look here, by binding just one molecule, you actually activate 100, if you look here, 10 to the second is 100 of these first messengers. So again, binding just one hormone activates 100 first messengers, which then goes to activate here. You end up activating 1,000 of your second messengers. Okay, or I'm sorry, 10,000. Sorry, I said 1,000. 10,000 of your second messengers. So again, that's binding one hormone activates 10,000 of your second messengers. Then on top of that, you can see that this message gets amplified as you activate each one of these down below. And ultimately, your response ends up being that you activate over 10 million of the molecules that you wanted to activate. So again, here, by binding just one hormone, you end up activating 10 million of the overall molecules that you wanted to activate. So that is the benefit of having a cascade pathway, and that's the benefit of having these water-soluble hormones, is again that by just binding the activation of just one receptor, by binding one hormone, can activate many, many proteins. So that is the benefit of water-soluble hormones. So now I'm going to go ahead and show you some animations because I'm hoping that the animations are helpful, and you guys can let me know, send me some feedback and let me know if these animations are helpful, and if they are, then I can always post the animations separate for you as well. So let me go ahead and bring up these animations. And the nice part is this animation is going to show you the mechanism of action for a steroid hormone, and then it will also show you the mechanism of action for a water soluble hormone or protein-based hormone. Okay, so take just a second here to pull this up. Hopefully. Oops, let me try this one more time. Slight technical difficulties there. Okay, so here we go. Here's the mechanism of action for a steroid hormone. So again, the steroid hormones, remember, are lipid soluble.
Steroid hormones are not water soluble. They travel in the blood attached to protein carriers.
Or I'm sorry, not water soluble.
When steroid hormones arrive at their target cells, they dissociate from their protein carriers and pass through the plasma membrane of the cell. Some steroid hormones bind to specific receptor proteins in the cytoplasm and then move as a hormone receptor complex into the nucleus. Other steroids travel directly into the nucleus before encountering their receptor proteins, not shown. The hormone receptor protein, activated by binding to the hormone, is now able to bind to specific regions of the DNA. These DNA regions are known as the hormone response elements. The binding of the hormone receptor complex has a direct effect on the level of transcription at that site. Messenger RNA, mRNA, is produced, which then codes for the synthesis of specific proteins.
Okay, so again, that is your steroid hormone, which is a lipid-soluble based hormone. So now, let's look at the action of epinephrine, which is going to be a protein-based or water-soluble hormone.
Epinephrine is one of many hormones that is water-soluble, hydrophilic, and therefore unable to cross the hydrophobic plasma membranes of its target cells. Instead, it binds to receptor proteins located in the plasma membrane and does not enter the cell. When epinephrine binds to beta-adrenergic receptors on the liver cell, G proteins on the inner side of the cell membrane are activated. Each G protein is composed of 3 subunits, and the binding of epinephrine to its receptor protein causes one of the G protein subunits to dissociate from the other 2. The G protein subunit which dissociates from the others carries a GDP, which is replaced by GTP when the subunit is activated. The activated G protein subunit then diffuses within the plasma membrane until it encounters adenylyl cyclase, a membrane enzyme that is inactive until it interacts with the G protein subunit. When activated by the G protein subunit, adenylyl cyclase catalyzes the formation of CAMP from ATP. The CAMP formed at the inner surface of the membrane diffuses within the cytoplasm, where it binds to and activates protein kinase A, an enzyme that adds phosphate groups to specific cellular proteins. In liver cells, protein kinase A phosphorylates and thereby activates another enzyme called phosphorylase, which converts glycogen into glucose 6-phosphate. The glucose 6-phosphate is then converted to glucose. Through this multi-step mechanism, epinephrine causes the liver to secrete glucose into the blood during the fight or flight reaction.
Okay, so again, don't get bogged down in the details. I show you this animation just so that you can see how this overall process works. I think it's kind of nice to know how this all works. But remember that you don't have to know G proteins and the cyclic AMP and the protein kinases and all that. You're not responsible for that. You just have to know that there's, again, the first messenger and the second messenger. But I think it's nice to be able to see how this all works. So again, hopefully these animations are helpful for you, and like I said, I can post these animations for you on Canvas, so that way then it will make it much easier for you to just kind of directly get to them instead of trying to get through them through the lecture. Okay, so let's see, let's get back here. So again, those are the mechanisms of action for the two classes of hormones. So hint, hint, it's important for you to know the differences on those two classes of hormones and how those two classes of hormones ultimately affect and regulate cells. Because again, their mechanism of action is very different. One can travel through, again, being that the steroid hormones can travel through that lipid bilayer, and the water-soluble or protein-based ones cannot. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about how we control hormonal secretions. So when hormones are secreted, how do we control or regulate when those hormones are going to be secreted from these certain glands? So hormone levels, again, have to be very precisely regulated, and that's because, of course, these hormones are regulating activities of the cell. So it's very important that they're precisely regulated. So we have certain control mechanisms. The release of what we call tropic hormones from the hypothalamus helps to control the secretions of the anterior pituitary gland. And so that's one mechanism of control. And this is what we call, and unfortunately this is not showing up here, but this is what we call hormonal control. So that's one main mechanism of action one main mechanism of control is hormonal control. And so we'll talk about this, and I'll show you some pictures of how the hypothalamus will secrete hormones that will then regulate the secretion of hormones from anterior pituitary. So believe it or not, we have hormones that control and regulate the secretion of other hormones. Hypothalamic hormones will control the secretion of anterior pituitary gland hormones. So that's what we call hormonal control. Then we also have the nervous system control. And the nervous system is going to, again, influence certain endocrine glands directly. And we'll talk about this again, being through the hypothalamus, we can directly control the release of hormones from the posterior pituitary gland through nerves. So that's nervous control. And then other glands will respond directly to changes in the internal fluid composition. So for example, some glands will respond to changes in calcium levels, and we'll talk about this like with the parathyroid gland. And so they'll directly respond to those changes in, maybe blood calcium levels, and that will control whether or not we secrete hormone. And that's called the humoral. Humoral being that, blood was considered one of the humors of the body, so that's why they call it humoral control. So again, these are the three mechanisms of action, and let's see if, there we go. Now you can see all of this here. So those are the three mechanisms of action: hormonal, nervous, and humoral. And that's what this is showing you here. Here are the three mechanisms of action. Here's humoral, and again, this is nice because it gives you an example. In this case here, you can see that what ends up happening is your blood calcium levels are low. So that's the low blood calcium levels are detected by certain receptors in the parathyroid glands, and that stimulates the parathyroid glands directly. So that low blood calcium level directly stimulates the parathyroid glands to release parathyroid hormone. And then you'll secrete that parathyroid hormone again into the blood, and of course, I'll remind you, but as we've already talked about, parathyroid hormone will then increase osteoclast activity, secreting calcium into the blood and raising blood calcium levels. So again, this is what we call humoral control, because we're we're directly controlling the secretion of the parathyroid glands through, again, the composition of blood. So the fact that there's low calcium composition in the blood. Then we have neural control, and neural control is just like it sounds. It's easy. It's direct control by the nervous system. The nervous system directly controls the secretion from a gland of a certain type of hormone. So again, in this case, they're showing a nerve directly, again, influencing the secretion of catecholamines from the adrenal gland. And then, in this case, this is hormonal control. And so here you can see the hypothalamus actually secretes a hormone, so hence hormonal control, secretes a hormone that will then control the secretion of certain hormones from the pituitary gland, and specifically the anterior pituitary gland. So, and then the pituitary gland will secrete hormone that will then directly influence the secretion of hormones from other glands as well, other endocrine glands. So again, this is where we have hormones that are controlling secretion of hormones that are controlling secretion of other hormones. That's hormonal control. So those are the three types of control. Now, when we talk about what type of feedback mechanism is in play with all of these hormones, negative feedback mechanisms are commonly what's controlling, oops, sorry, I just drew all over that, commonly what controls hormonal releases. So typically, usually, again, a gland will be sensitive to the concentration of the substance that it regulates, or it'll be sensitive to some type of substance that regulates it. So let me, again, kind of remind you how negative feedback works. So in this case, here we have, an average concentration of a certain hormone that we'd like to maintain in the body. So again, this would be, our attempt to maintain homeostasis, right? And so, again, typically, though, our actual concentration of hormone levels, okay, vary a little bit. So what happens is, again, hormone levels move away from homeostasis and become a little high, and then typically, again, our negative feedback mechanism will then turn off the secretion of that hormone, and then it'll drop back down. Now, as it drops below our homeostasis level, then again, secretion of that hormone will be stimulated or activated, and now the hormone level in the body comes back up. So again, you're going to see that we kind of have this wavering roller coaster up and down that helps us to maintain, again, levels of hormone around homeostasis. So that's negative feedback. Again, remember, we're turning on or turning off secretion of hormone depending upon how close we are, again, to that homeostatic level. So remember, again, negative feedback is always associated with maintaining homeostasis. Okay, so this is just going to show you the location of some of our major endocrine glands, and then we're going to, get into talking about the different types of hormones that are released from these glands, and specifically what those hormones are involved with. So here you're going to see we have the hypothalamus gland in the brain. Again, is going to be associated with secreting hormones that control the release of hormones from the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is actually directly below the hypothalamus. It's actually attached to the hypothalamus by a little stalk. So there's a little stalk, and you can actually see this, especially when you dissect the sheep's brain. If you ever take Bio 201 and you dissect the sheep's brain, you'll actually see this. There'll be a little stalk hanging off, and that'll be right below the hypothalamus of the brain, and then you'll see the big pituitary gland. And so the pituitary gland, again, is just below that hypothalamus. And then the pineal gland is deep within the interior of the brain. It's a really tiny gland. And so that's also an endocrine gland. The parathyroid glands are going to be these 4 little glands that are going to be directly posterior or behind the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is going to be this kind of goofy shaped gland here that's going to be right around the throat region. The thymus gland will be just below that. And then the adrenal glands will be on top of the kidneys. The pancreas is going to be in the digestive tract. It's one of your digestive organs, even though it also is an organ of the endocrine system and that it has an endocrine function. So we'll talk about the pancreas and how it has both endocrine and exocrine functions. And then you have the ovary and the testes, which are also considered, again, endocrine organs in that they're going to be involved with having tissue that secretes hormones. So let's talk about each of these organs now and each of these glands and what their function is. The pituitary gland is kind of an interesting one. If you look at the pituitary gland, again, it's attached to the base of the brain, especially attached to the base of the hypothalamus of the brain. And it has an anterior lobe, and we call this the anterior pituitary. And then it has a posterior lobe called the posterior pituitary. These are going to be very different because, as you're going to see, the anterior pituitary gland is going to secrete 6 different hormones, and the posterior pituitary is only going to secrete 2 hormones. So the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus are going to control the secretion from the anterior pituitary. So again, in this case, for the anterior pituitary, the hypothalamus is going to secrete hormones that will then control the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. So this is hormonal control. Okay, so here, the anterior pituitary is under what we call hormonal control. Again, here, the hypothalamus is going to secrete hormones that then regulate the secretion of hormones from the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is going to release hormones into the bloodstream in response to nervous stimuli. So there are nerves that, again, run from the hypothalamus all the way down to the posterior pituitary, and those nerves will regulate the secretion of hormone from the posterior pituitary. So that's a major difference between anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. Again, sorry I forgot, but this is hormonal, under hormonal control. Anterior pituitary is under hormonal control, and the posterior pituitary is under nervous control. So this is just showing you the flow of blood vessels to the anterior pituitary, which obviously is very important because, again, the anterior pituitary is under hormonal control. So hormones are going to be released from the hypothalamus and travel down through the blood vessels into the anterior pituitary, where they can affect secretion of hormones in the anterior pituitary. So again, this is just walking you through the mechanism of action, controlling hormones, enter their blood from the hypothalamus, travel through these portal veins into the anterior pituitary via these capillaries. And that's where they're going to control the secretion of hormone from the anterior pituitary. So now let's talk about the different types of hormones. Remember, the anterior pituitary is going to release 6 different hormones, and the posterior pituitary will only release 2. So let's talk about the 6 different hormones that are going to be released from the anterior pituitary. The first one is going to be growth hormone, and growth hormone is going to stimulate body cells to grow and reproduce. So it actually stimulates cell division, and it'll actually stimulate those cells to increase in size as well. It also speeds up the rate at which cells are going to use carbohydrates and fats, and that helps cells to grow. So I'll come back to these 2 in just a minute, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about growth hormone. Growth hormone, again, is going to have pretty wide-ranging effects on the body overall. Postnatal growth hormone is going to be signaled by, or postnatal growth, is going to be signaled by your growth hormone. So again, after a baby is born, growth hormone is going to be released And that growth hormone that's released from the anterior pituitary will influence growth. And that's oftentimes where we see these growth spurts. Now, there are other factors that obviously influence growth besides growth hormone. So growth capacity is genetically determined again. There's a genetic component to how tall you can grow no matter how much growth hormone again. That you're producing. There is a limit to, again, each individual in terms of genetics, and genetics will oftentimes determine when growth hormone is produced. Adequate diet obviously is an influential factor. If you're not taking in enough protein, then you don't have enough protein to make what you need to grow. Freedom from chronic disease and stress is obviously another factor. Normal levels of other growth influencing hormones is another factor. So again, there are other factors besides just growth hormone. But growth hormone plays a very large part in it. And for example, some of you may have known he used to be an actor. He played Andre. He was Andre the Giant, is what they called him. And he was an actor. He was really large, and he was in movies like the Princess Bride, if you like those types of movies, one of my favorites. And so if you look at him, he's a very large individual. He's tall. He's very large. And the reason that he was so large is that he actually had an anterior pituitary gland tumor that caused him to secrete too much growth hormone. So again, that's how important growth hormone is, though, to our overall growth. Okay, so that's growth hormone. Then there's prolactin. Prolactin's another hormone that's released from the anterior pituitary. And obviously prolactin does just kind of what it sounds like. You think of prolactin, the word lactate, so it promotes milk production or lactation following the birth of an infant. Now, interestingly, men too do also produce prolactin. However, obviously they're not promoting milk production. So what ends up happening is in men, we think, we're not sure exactly what prolactin does, but we think that prolactin is involved with helping to maintain normal sperm production. So then there's thyroid stimulating hormone, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute, but thyroid stimulating hormone helps to control the secretion of hormones from the thyroid gland, and we'll talk about these hormones that are released from the thyroid gland are oftentimes very important in controlling metabolic reactions or our metabolism. Okay, so let me skip past this slide again. Sorry about that. So those were the first three hormones. So now we're going to talk about the last three hormones that are secreted from that anterior pituitary gland. So the fourth one is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now a long word, right? Or oftentimes abbreviated ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And this helps to control the secretion of hormones from the adrenal cortex. And these are going to, primarily these hormones that are going to be released from the adrenal cortex are going to be involved with our kind of stress hormone response. So especially our sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight response. So we'll talk about that. Also, follicle stimulating hormone, and so this is really 5 and 6, I should say. So 5 is follicle stimulating hormone, and 6 is luteinizing hormone. And these are going to be gonadotropins, we call gonadotropins, that are going to affect the male and female gonad or sex organs. And so we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later here. Then we have, remember, the posterior pituitary gland. And the posterior pituitary gland is going to release 2 hormones. One is your antidiuretic hormone, and 2 is oxytocin. So remember, the posterior pituitary gland is a little bit different. We actually call it the neurohypophysis because it's under nervous system control. So what this means is the posterior pituitary gland does not actually synthesize hormones. What it does is it consists of these axon terminals. Now that you know what axons are, these axon terminals from the hypothalamic neurons. So from these neurons that travel all the way down the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary. And those neurons are actually going to release neurotransmitter. And that's the neurotransmitter that these neurons release that is actually the hormone. So that's how the posterior pituitary gland works. So again, here you can see this is under the posterior pituitary is under nervous control because literally you have these nerves that are running from the hypothalamus down into the posterior pituitary that are going to release the neurotransmitter that is going to be released into the blood. And those two, again, hormones, we call them hormones because they're released into the blood, are going to be antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. So let's talk about what these two hormones do. Antidiuretic hormone actually produces its effects, and we're going to talk about this again when we get into the urinary system, but it actually produces its effect by causing the kidneys to conserve water. And so it's probably easiest to explain this by what happens when antidiuretic hormones inhibited. So if any of you have partaken in drinking alcohol, alcohol actually inhibits the release of antidiuretic hormone. And when it does that, it inhibits that release of that antidiuretic hormone, then it cancels out that effect of conserving water. And so instead of conserving water, then you get rid of that water and you expel that water in the process of urination. So that's why you have excess urination when you drink too much alcohol. So you can thank that inhibition of antidiuretic hormone for the reason why you have to go urinate more frequently when you drink alcohol. And then the posterior pituitary is also responsible for this lovely hormone called oxytocin. I say lovely because for all of you that have experienced childbirth and labor, then you may not call this hormone so lovely. And it's because it's the one that plays the role in childbirth. It's the one that's responsible for your contractions, those contracting muscles in the uterine wall that cause those lovely, painful contractions of child labor. It's also responsible for milk letdown in the mammary glands, which is why oftentimes a breastfeeding mother will, especially early on, feel contractions in the uterus when she's breastfeeding because, again, oxytocin is a hormone that's released to stimulate milk letdown. So those are the two major hormones from the posterior pituitary. Okay, so now let's get into the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is going to be located below the larynx, so in the throat below the larynx, and it's going to consist of these two broad lobes that are going to be connected by this isthmus. So literally it kind of looks like... This is a horrible drawing again. Please remember that I am not an artist. But this would be your thyroid gland. You have these two lobes, and then they're going to be connected by this broad isthmus there. And the thyroid gland is going to put out two hormones. First one, thyroid hormone, which is actually going to increase your metabolism. So it's responsible for increasing these metabolic reactions that occur in the body. And then there's calcitonin. And so you may remember calcitonin from our last series of lectures when we talked about controlling blood calcium levels. And calcitonin, if you remember, is released when blood calcium levels are high. And what it does is it actually decreases blood calcium levels to bring us back to homeostasis. So that's calcitonin. Now, the parathyroid glands are going to be these 4 tiny little glands that are located directly behind the thyroid gland. So again, here's the back of, you can see little pieces of the thyroid gland, of each lobe of the thyroid gland here. And that's because you're looking at this from the posterior. If you looked at it from the front, you would see again, the thyroid gland would connect over here to this lobe. Something like that if you were looking at it from the front, but we're looking at it from the back, so we just see again these 2 little pieces of the lobes. And you'll see here are those 4 tiny, in green here are those 4 tiny little parathyroid glands. Okay? And so the parathyroid glands are responsible for releasing, lo and behold, parathyroid hormone. How nice is this, right? After doing the nervous system, you have some nice straightforward information here. Parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone. And your parathyroid hormone, if you remember again from our previous lectures, the parathyroid hormone actually increases blood calcium levels. So remember that when blood calcium levels dip, then the parathyroid gland will be stimulated to secrete parathyroid hormone, and parathyroid hormone will actually increase our osteoclast activity. And remember, osteoclasts help to break down, again, some of that bony matrix, releasing calcium into the blood and thereby increasing our blood calcium levels and bringing us back to homeostasis. So remember, calcitonin and parathyroid hormone exert opposite effects in regulating calcium ions and in the blood. And so what we do is we call these 2 hormones, when they produce opposite effects, we call them antagonist hormones. Antagonist. Literally, that word means opposite effects. Okay? So these 2 hormones are antagonist hormones. So this is kind of a nice, again, overview of this. You can see here, if we were to have high levels of calcium, again, in the blood, this will stimulate the thyroid gland to secrete calcitonin, and calcitonin will inhibit our osteoclast activity and thereby decrease our overall blood calcium levels. And so now, if our blood calcium levels dip too low, then this will stimulate the parathyroid gland to release parathyroid hormone. And that parathyroid hormone will ultimately, through a roundabout way, stimulate the release of calcium into the blood, raising our blood calcium levels back up. So that way then we always maintain our blood calcium levels to be, again, at a homeostatic level. Now you guys can understand why this is so important, because remember that when we talked about muscle contraction, remember how important calcium is to muscle contraction, because we require calcium to bind to the troponin tropomyosin complex, right? I know you're like, no, I didn't want to remember that, but again, it's important to remember how important blood calcium is. And so that's why we have these 2 hormones that very specifically regulate our blood calcium levels to be at this, homeostatic level, because blood calcium levels are extremely important to, again, the nervous system. They're important to the muscular system. So we have to maintain very tight control on our blood calcium levels. So these are these 2 opposing hormones. The adrenal glands are going to be right above the kidneys here. And so here's the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands are typically, again, enclosed in a layer of fat. So that's why they've drawn them in yellow. You can see that they're enclosed in that layer of fat. And if you were to look at the adrenal gland has what we call cortex on the outside, and then the interior is what we call the adrenal medulla. And so the adrenal medulla is going to secrete hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine. And remember, these two hormones have an effect on the sympathetic nervous system. And so they're associated with the effects of the sympathetic nervous system. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to, again, be associated with your fight or flight response. So you don't have to memorize what these do. Just think of what's involved with your fight or flight response when you're being chased by the scary man or the scary bear or the scary woman again. Could be, okay? So epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to, again, be responsible for increasing your heart rate, right? Increasing your overall cardiac output. So that way then you can, have enough oxygen, okay, to your muscles so that you can run away from the scary bear, scary man, or scary woman, okay? So again, it's going to increase your heart rate. It's going to increase your force of cardiac muscle contraction, increase your breathing rate, increase blood glucose levels. Again, all of these are to increase that overall blood oxygen levels, increase the, again, rate at which you can bring that oxygen to the tissues, so that way then you can do the muscle contraction that you need to be able to run away from the scary bear, scary man, scary woman, okay? It also elevates blood pressure and decreases digestive activity. So everything associated with that fight or flight response. So the cells of the adrenal cortex are going to produce over 30 different steroids. The most important of these are going to be aldosterone, which helps us to retain sodium in the kidneys. And so we'll talk about that when we get to the urinary system, why that's important. And also cortisol. Cortisol helps to increase metabolism, and it's what's associated with, again, stress. This is your stress hormone, cortisol. And then also certain sex hormones as well. So those are hormones that are released from the adrenal cortex. So remember, epinephrine, norepinephrine are going to be released from the adrenal medulla, the interior of the adrenal glands. And then the exterior of the adrenal glands, the adrenal cortex, is going to release the aldosterone, cortisol, and some sex hormones. Pancreas. So when we talk about the pancreas, pancreas is going to have both an endocrine and an exocrine function. So we'll come back to and talk about its exocrine function when we get to the digestive system. We talk about how digestive juices are going to be secreted through a duct, okay, into the digestive tract. And because digestive juices are secreted through a duct, not into the bloodstream, but through a duct, then that is, again, an exocrine function. But here, the pancreas also has an endocrine function. So that's why the pancreas is actually considered to be part of the endocrine system and part of the digestive system. And so the pancreas secretes hormones into the blood as well. And that's its endocrine function. And that's why it's considered to be an endocrine gland. Hormones of the pancreas are going to secrete two major hormones into the blood, glucagon and insulin. Glucagon and insulin are antagonist hormones. They're going to have opposite effects. Okay, so glucagon actually will increase the blood levels of glucose by stimulating the breakdown of glycogen, and it will do this when blood glucose levels are low. So when blood glucose levels are low, we'll secrete glucagon, and that will ultimately stimulate the breakdown of glycogen into glucose and release glucose into the blood. Insulin is going to have just the opposite effect. Insulin decreases the blood levels of glucose, and it actually stimulates the uptake of glucose into places like the liver and into the muscles, and then that glucose will be converted into glycogen where it could be stored. So again, insulin does just the opposite. So those are antagonist hormones. So this is kind of showing you again these two opposing hormones and how they work. Remember here, if you have high blood sugar, let's say you just ate a Big Mac, okay, maybe, or you ate whatever your favorite, food is that might have that may have a lot of sugar in it. Okay, maybe you had some coffee to keep you awake, and that coffee had a lot of sugar, through this lecture. And so when you take in a lot of sugar, that's going to cause a spike in your blood sugar. And when it causes that spike in your blood sugar, then that's going to stimulate the pancreas to release insulin. That insulin will then stimulate the uptake of glucose from the blood into places like the liver and the muscle. And in the liver and the muscle, then that glucose will be converted into glycogen, its storage form. Okay. Now, if for some reason our blood glucose levels or blood sugar levels drop too low, then this will stimulate the pancreas then to release glucagon instead, and it will inhibit the release of insulin. So then glucagon, once it's released into the bloodstream, will then stimulate, and it will travel to the liver and stimulate the breakdown of glycogen into glucose, and then glucose will be released into the bloodstream. And that will help raise our blood glucose levels back to their normal level. So again, we have that seesaw effect here. So again, blood sugar levels get too high, we release insulin to bring us back down to our normal level. Blood glucose levels drop too low, and then we'll release glucagon to bring us back up. Now, of course, this is always fun because then we might as well talk about pancreatic disorders. And so diabetes mellitus is one of the biggest pancreatic disorders. And this is a group of disorders that's caused by an inability to produce or to use insulin. Okay? So type 1 diabetes is our inability to produce insulin, or our inability to produce an efficient form of insulin. So type 1 diabetes, or what we call insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, is caused by an absolute deficiency of insulin. And so because we're not producing insulin, then a type 1 diabetes individual must take in insulin on a daily basis. So again, that's why we call it insulin-dependent diabetes. Now, type 2 diabetes is a case where we have an inability to use insulin. So in a type 2 diabetes individual, that individual is producing enough insulin. It's just that they're no longer producing enough of the insulin receptors. And this often happens again when what happens is we constantly are kind of we constantly have sugars out in the bloodstream, and so insulin's constantly being released, and we have lots of insulin that's being released. What ends up happening is over time the body starts to say, okay, well, we always have this insulin out there, so maybe we don't need to produce as many insulin receptors on our cells anymore, and it'll start to downregulate the insulin receptors. And so basically in type 2 diabetes, your body stops listening to the insulin that's being released. So this is what we call type 2 diabetes, or insulin-independent diabetes. And again, it's caused by a downregulation of insulin receptors. So we stop producing the insulin receptors, so the body stops listening basically to insulin. So in our diabetes cases, oftentimes the symptoms for diabetes are these are the three big ones: polyuria, polydipsia, polyphagia. Polyuria is, just like it sounds, excess urine. Polydipsia is excessive thirst, and then polyphagia is excessive eating. So those are your pancreatic disorders, and that is the end of the endocrine lecture. So again, hopefully you enjoyed the endocrine lecture, and that it's nice and straightforward. It's an easy one for you guys just to make note cards of these endocrine glands and what they do and what hormones are released from them, and then make note cards of these hormones and what they're responsible for. So again, as always, if you have any questions, you can write to me on Canvas, or you can also send me an email. And other than that, have a good night.